I was just sitting there, waiting for my son. The flowers in my lap were from his garden. He always brings me flowers when I visit.
She was in my way, that's all. An old woman in a wheelchair, blocking the entire entrance like she owned it. I had a meeting. I had somewhere to be. So I moved her.
The flowers fell, all of them, scattered across the steps like broken things. I did not cry out. I have survived worse than this. But I thought, is there no one here? Is there no one who will?
I heard it from inside the lobby. That sound. I knew what it was before I even turned around. I've been a nurse for 9 years. I know the sound of someone being hurt. I dropped everything. I pushed through that crowd. And when I saw her, that woman in the wheelchair, flowers all over the ground, hand raised to strike her again, something in me went very, very quiet.
Move her out of my way.
I caught her wrist in the air. I looked her dead in the eyes and I said, "Don't touch her again."
A nurse, a nobody, hit me.
And that was the moment I stopped wondering if there was anyone left in this world worth protecting.
She didn't know whose mother she had just protected. She didn't know who was watching from behind that glass. She only knew one thing. Some things cannot be allowed, no matter the cost. This is her story. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to the Christy J Story family. We tell stories that make you feel something real. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story, it is just getting started. And drop a comment below. Tell me, if you were standing in that crowd and you watched that woman get slapped in that wheelchair, what would you have done? Would you have stepped forward or would you have frozen like everyone else? Be honest. The comment section is open. Now, let's go. Inside the lobby, just beyond the glass entrance, a man stood very still. He was the kind of man that rooms adjusted to. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded it, but because something about the way he occupied space made everything around him quieter. His suit was dark. His face was calm. His eyes missed nothing. He had been watching since the moment the wheelchair rolled to a stop outside. He had been watching when she arrived, designer heels clicking against the pavement, phone already in hand, not looking where she was going. He had been watching when the flowers scattered, when the slap landed. His jaw tightened, just once, just barely. He took one step toward the glass door. His security detail shifted immediately, reading him the way men like them learn to read silence. He stopped. His hand came up, the smallest gesture. Not yet. They stilled. He stood there, watching the crowd freeze, watching the phones rise, watching the woman in the wheelchair sit with a dignity that made something move in his chest. And then, his eyes found her. The nurse. Blue scrubs, badge swinging. On one knee beside the wheelchair like she had been placed there by something larger than instinct. He watched her check the old woman's face, her neck, her breathing. He watched her rise slowly when the hand lifted again. He watched her catch the wrist. He watched her eyes. Steady, he thought. No fear, no calculation. Just steady. When the slap landed, controlled, precise, consequence rather than rage, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He didn't have a name for it yet. He only knew that he did not look away. His security leaned in quietly. "Sir, the cameras caught everything. It's already online." He didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed on the nurse, now speaking quietly to the old woman, brushing a loose hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. "I know," he said finally, and he still did not move. He told himself he stayed because acting publicly would be a mistake. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself a lot of things standing behind that glass. But the truth was simpler than strategy. He wanted to see what she would do next. Her name was Mrs. Hahn, 73 years old. She had raised her son alone in a country that did not make space for women like her. She had worked with her hands until her hands stopped cooperating. She had never once asked him to fight a battle she could survive herself. When the slap landed, she had not cried out. When the flowers scattered, she had watched them fall without reaching. Because she had learned a long time ago that dignity is not about what happens to you. It is about how you carry it. Now, inside the lobby, her son walked beside her wheelchair in silence. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked back, through the glass, at the nurse. Still outside, still calm, talking to a security guard who had finally found his courage after the fact. "She's been fighting for 2 years," Mrs. Hahn said quietly. Her son looked down at her. "What?" "That nurse." She folded her hands in her lap. "I can see it in the way she stands. People who are fighting for something stand differently than people who are comfortable." He was quiet. She let the silence sit. Then, "Her name is Zara." He looked at her sharply. She almost smiled. "I asked the valet." What neither of them said out loud, what the audience now learns, Zara had been fighting for exactly 2 years, a false complaint, filed by a powerful family, against a nurse who refused to look the other way when their patriarch was being abusive to her staff. Her license, suspended pending reinstatement review. 9 years of service, suspended. She had spent 2 years navigating appeals, hearings, character references, legal fees she could barely afford. She was 3 months from the finish line. 3 months. And she had just slapped the fiancé of the most powerful man in Los Angeles. In public. On camera. She knew what it would cost her. She calculated it in the 3 seconds between catching that wrist and making her choice. 3 months from everything she had fought for. And she looked at that woman in the wheelchair, flowers on the ground, dignified even in humiliation. And she thought, some things cannot be calculated. Some things just cannot be allowed. Mrs. Hahn looked back through the glass one final time. Then she looked up at her son. Her eyes, steady, quiet, devastating. "Now you know the difference," she said. "Between a woman who has power." She glanced toward the entrance where the fiancé was already on her phone. "And a woman who has character." He said nothing, but his hands, perfectly still until that moment, slowly closed into fists. The crowd dispersed the way crowds always do after something uncomfortable. Slowly, reluctantly, still whispering. The fiancée stood at the entrance, composing herself with the efficiency of a woman who had been trained since childhood to never let them see the damage. Her name was Victoria, and Victoria did not crumble. Victoria weaponized. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, looked at the nurse, still standing near the entrance doors, badge catching the afternoon light, with the focused attention of someone memorizing a target. "Do you know who I am?" The nurse didn't answer. She turned back to where Mrs. Hahn had been sitting, bent down, picked up one of the scattered flowers from the step, looked at it for a moment, then set it carefully on the ledge beside the entrance door. That silence, that quiet, deliberate, completely unbothered silence was the most expensive thing Zara had ever done, and she knew it. Victoria knew it too. By evening, she moved with surgical precision. The board chairman, personal call. 15 years of carefully maintained friendship deployed in 4 minutes. The head of nursing, summoned to a private meeting, reminded of 3 separate favors Victoria's family had provided to this hospital over the past decade. The formal misconduct complaint, filed within the hour, detailed, documented, airtight on paper, This was not anger. Anger is messy. This was architecture. She was building something designed to end Zara completely, not just fired, erased. License gone, career over. An example made of a woman who thought blue scrubs were armor enough to touch Victoria Hahn. Late that night, the hospital break room was empty. Zara sat alone at the small table by the window. The complaint letter sat in front of her. She read it once, slowly, every word. Then she folded it, tucked it into her pocket, looked up at the ceiling. 3 months, she whispered. Just 3 months. She didn't cry. She had used all her tears 2 years ago. She just sat there, in the quiet, and breathed. Hold on. Before we go further, if this story is pulling you in, make sure you are subscribed. And drop a comment right now. Tell me, would you have done what Zara did, knowing everything you'd lose? Or would you have walked away? I want to know. The following morning, Zara arrived for her shift the way she always did, chin up, badge on, moving like someone who had decided before her feet hit the floor that today would not break her. She pushed through the staff entrance and stopped. He was waiting. Not in the lobby, not surrounded by security, alone, standing by the window of a private consultation room just off the main corridor, door open, like an invitation that hadn't been spoken yet. She didn't go in immediately. She stood in the doorway, looked at him the way you look at something you don't fully have the language for yet. He spoke first. You don't seem afraid of consequences. She set her bag down, didn't rush, didn't perform calm. Was calm. The way people are calm when they have already accepted the worst. I knew exactly what it would cost me, she said. I did it anyway. He watched her. She had still not asked his name, had not looked at the security she could sense positioned in the corridor behind her, had not adjusted herself by a single degree for the weight of him. Most people in your position, he said, would be negotiating right now. She met his eyes directly. I don't negotiate the things I'm not willing to compromise. Something moved across his face, gone before she could name it. He stood, moved toward the door, then stopped, back still to her. Your shift starts in 4 minutes. She stared at his back. You know my schedule. Not a question. He walked out without answering. She stood in that room for a moment after he left, looking at the space where he had been standing. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her badge, and went to work. 3 minutes and 40 seconds to spare. That evening, his penthouse sat above Los Angeles like a place that had decided the rest of the city was someone else's problem. He stood at the window. His advisor, a man who had been with him for 11 years and had learned to read silence the way other men read text, sat across the room with a file in his hands. The footage was at 7 million views. The comments were not kind to Victoria. The complaint has teeth, his advisor said. The board is nervous. They don't want the public attention. They want it quiet. Her reinstatement review has been formally flagged. One more step and she loses everything she spent 2 years rebuilding. He didn't turn from the window. She protected my mother. Yes. His advisor's voice was careful, even. And if you protect her openly, your rivals read it as sentiment. You know what sentiment costs in our world. The city glowed below, indifferent, enormous, full of people making calculations. Then we don't do it openly, he said. His advisor studied him. And Victoria? A long pause, the kind of pause that contains a decision already made. She made her choice at that entrance. His advisor looked down at the file, opened it slowly. Inside, Zara's full profile. Employment history, 9 years of commendations, the reinstatement timeline, the original false complaint, filed by a family whose name his advisor recognized immediately. She's been fighting this alone, his advisor said quietly. 2 years. No powerful family behind her. No connections. Just fighting. He finally turned from the window, crossed the room, took the file, looked at her photograph, taken from her hospital ID. Chin up, direct, like someone who had decided before the photo was taken that it would not show what the last 2 years had cost her. He closed the file. He told himself it was about his mother, that this was loyalty, not sentiment, strategy, not feeling. He was very good at telling himself things. He set the file on his desk and did not put it away. 3 days later, Victoria's world began shifting in ways she could not explain and could not see. The board chairman's assistant called back. Not him, his assistant, to reschedule. A lunch with the hospital legal team, canceled. No reason given. Apologies for the inconvenience. Her formal complaint, filed urgently, filed perfectly, returned on a procedural technicality so minor it could only have been found by someone specifically looking for it. She was not naive. She had grown up in rooms full of powerful men. She knew what deliberate silence sounded like. She arrived at his penthouse without calling ahead, past his staff because she still had that access, past his security because they hadn't been told yet to stop her. She found him at his desk, calm, unsurprised. What did you do? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't. Her voice fractured at the edges, not sadness, fury, the kind that comes from finally understanding something you cannot unknow. She is a nobody, a nurse. You're protecting a nobody over me? Over everything we built? He looked up from his desk for the first time. His eyes, quiet, final, like a door swinging closed on its own weight. She protected my mother. I am going to be your wife, were. One word. The room went absolutely still. She understood everything in that silence, not just that she had lost, but when. She had lost it at the hospital entrance, the moment she raised her hand. Before any complaint, before any call, before any of it. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, turned back, composed now, dangerously composed. She has no idea what world she just stepped into. He held her gaze without flinching. Neither did you. The door closed, and that was that. 9 years, gone in one word. Were. The letter arrived at the nurse's station at 7 a.m. Report to administration, immediately. Zara read it twice, folded it, put it in her pocket, next to the complaint letter she still hadn't thrown away. She walked the corridor slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she had been here before. 2 years ago, a different hospital, a different corridor, the same letter, the same feeling sitting in her chest like a stone that had forgotten how to sink. She had survived it then. She straightened her badge, pushed open the administration door. The room was wrong immediately. Too quiet for a termination, too still for a board review. He was standing, not seated, by the far window. Mrs. Hahn was in her wheelchair near the center of the room, hands folded, watching the door with an expression Zara couldn't read yet. The administrator spoke first. Miss Zara, thank you for coming. My complaint, Zara said. Has it been dismissed, the administrator said, fully, with a formal letter of apology from the board to follow. Zara went very still. And my reinstatement review? Closed, in your favor, effective immediately. She stood there, processing. Then she looked at him, really looked. And the administrator said the words quietly, almost gently, as though they were doing her a kindness by telling her slowly, "Miss Zara, the gentleman you are looking at." "I know who he is," Zara said. Because she did now. She had spent the last 3 days quietly, carefully, finding out exactly who had been standing behind that glass. Korean Mafia boss. The kind of power that doesn't appear in newspapers. The kind that moves underneath everything. Quiet, invisible, absolute. She had known for 2 days. She had come to work anyway. She turned to face him fully now, eyes steady, voice low and precise. "Then you should have stopped it." The room waited. Mrs. Hahn watched, and nobody moved. The administrator quietly excused herself. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt much louder than it was. Mrs. Hahn remained. She was not leaving. Zara stood her ground, badge straight, breathing even, looking at a man who could erase people the way other men delete emails. He responded, no apology in his voice, no performance. "If I had stopped it," he held her gaze, "I wouldn't have seen who you are." She didn't soften. "That's a very expensive way to learn something." "You're still licensed," he said, "still employed, still standing." The weight of 2 years lived in the pause that followed. Every hearing, every appeal, every morning she showed up anyway. "Was it?" he asked. She had no answer. The audience had no answer. Mrs. Hahn, who had been silent through all of it, spoke for the first time since the room had emptied. Her voice was quiet, unhurried, the voice of a woman who has earned the right to say exactly what she means. "I asked him not to move." Both of them turned. She looked only at Zara. "I wanted to see who you were, too." Zara stared at her, the full weight of it landing slowly. She was never just protecting a stranger. This woman had been watching, waiting, testing. Not him, her. Against everything, against the 2 years and the complaint letter still in her pocket, and the Korean Mafia boss standing 3 feet away, Zara almost laughed. Not from happiness, from the sheer, exhausted, overwhelming weight of understanding that some things are so much larger than the moment they happen in. "You knew," she said quietly. Mrs. Hahn simply folded her hands and smiled, the way mothers smile when they already know the ending. He watched her, this woman who had calculated the cost in 3 seconds and paid it anyway. This woman who had come to work for 3 days knowing who he was. This woman who was not afraid of him, not even slightly. He thought he had been in rooms with presidents, with generals, with men who controlled the movement of entire economies, and he had never felt quite this, off balance. Early morning, the hospital entrance, same valet area, same glass doors, same Los Angeles light, soft and golden, hitting the same polished steps. Zara walked in for her first shift back, reinstated, cleared, badge in place. She slowed at the entrance, looked at the spot where the wheelchair had been, where the flowers had scattered, where she had made a decision that should have destroyed the last 2 years of her life, and somehow, impossibly, hadn't. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded complaint letter, looked at it one last time, then dropped it into the bin beside the entrance door. She exhaled, long, slow, like setting something down she had been carrying for a very long time. Footsteps behind her, unhurried, certain. She didn't turn around, she already knew. He stopped beside her, not close, not far, and looked at the same spot on the steps. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The morning moved around them, valets, visitors, the ordinary machinery of a day beginning. Then, "She wants to see you again, my mother." Zara looked at the entrance doors. "Is she all right?" "She's been asking for you since the second day." A beat, the whole story sitting in that silence. Everything it had cost. Everything it had somehow returned. She straightened her badge, looked forward. Tell her I'll come after my shift. She walked through the doors. He watched her go. The morning light caught her badge as she moved through the lobby, still swinging, the way it had been when she sprinted through that same lobby 4 days ago, before she knew any of it, before the flowers, before the glass, before him. He stood at the entrance for 1 moment longer, and then, for the first time in this entire story, he smiled. That was the beginning. And that, Christy J. Story family, is where we leave them. At the beginning. Now I need to know, drop a comment right now. What would you have done if you were Zara 3 months from getting your life back and you saw that woman slap that elderly lady? Would you have stepped forward? Or would you have told yourself, not my business, not today? Be honest, because honestly, I think most of us want to be Zara. But in that moment, with that much to lose, it takes something rare. Tell me what you would have done. And if you want part 2, because Victoria said she has no idea what world she just stepped into, and I promise you, neither do we, then subscribe, hit that bell, and let me know in the comments, part 2, yes or no. My husband has a car with my name on it at 10,000 subscribers, so if you want me behind that wheel, you know what to do. I love this family. I'll see you in the next one.